afternoon. Good afternoon. If we can take our seats, please. Good afternoon. My name is John O'Brien. I'm the head of communications with MCC Brussels. A few years ago, I was doing work in Africa, and I was observing a panel pretty much like this. And the African leader who was moderating the panel kept on getting down and holding people's hands in the audience. Strange, I thought. So I said to him, is that some type of tribal African cultural tradition to do this? He said, no, I saw it at a management seminar in Boston. He said, people are really scared of falling asleep. So I promise I will not hold your hands this afternoon because we have a very interesting topic to explore that takes another layer off the onion of this conversation about multiculturalism. Central to the multicultural debate is the role of diversity. As a fact of life, diversity is unavoidable, unobjectionable, and often enriching. But today's elites go further. Diversity, they say, is a special value, meaning the celebration of differences. But many citizens feel that what unites us in national cultures, or indeed as Europeans, is equality, or even more important, is there room for the importance of national attachment and a common culture within the debates about multiculturalism? What does it even mean to celebrate diversity? Are those who refuse to celebrate diversity simply bigots? Or do they have legitimate concerns about the tendency of multicultural policies to divide society rather than unite it? That's what we're going to be exploring this afternoon. We are going to hear from the panel, and I'm delighted to have this panel with us. To begin with, Dr. Natalia Borza, a research fellow with MCC Brussels. She is an applied linguist and doctoral student of philosophy. She obtained her PhD from the School of English and American Studies in Budapest. From 2013, she was teaching at the Institute for International Relations and Political Science at the Catholic University there. Her research looks at how ideas and concepts enter politics and the media and how the public perceives controversial issues. Then we'll hear from Alka Cuthbert, founder and director, Don't Divide Us, and author of What Schools Should Teach. Cuthbert is an educator, academic, author, and campaigner who believes passionately in the essential importance of impartiality, both in education and as a prerequisite for the civilized conversations necessary for a democracy to flourish. She became director of Don't Divide Us following 2 years as its founder lead on education, a campaign which she felt impelled to join as a counter to the type of fractious and one-sided discussions about race relations that were happening in the UK. Last but not least, we're going to hear from Dr. Boris Havel, Associate Professor of Middle East Studies at the University of Zagreb, Croatia. Dr. Havel earned a BA in International Relationships and a BA in History at the Oral Roberts University in Uppsala, Sweden, an MA in Comparative Religion at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He worked as Associate Professor at the Department of Comparative Politics at the Faculty of Political Science in the University of Zagreb in Croatia. That's our panelists for today. I think most importantly, we have a value at MCC Brussels, and it is that the audience is very important, and we really want to engage the audience in conversation. So I'm going to say to you now that when we finish with the panel, I will be coming out. So if you have a question, if you have something to say, please, now is the time to say it. Not when you're going home in the metro and you're saying to yourself, I should have said something. This is going to be your opportunity to do that. So let's start with Natalia. As a linguist, how would you explain the very concept of diversity? What does diversity mean?
Right, so first of all, thank you for having me. As you said, I'm a discourse analyst, which means that I analyze written text and spoken discussions. And currently, I've been carrying out a pilot study on EU documents, how the EU policies deal with diversity. I wanted to understand what diversity means there, what is explicitly stated and what is implied. And with my research, first I started out with to have a look at the concept of diversity. And actually, this is a Socratic method that first you want to clarify the concept so that we avoid misunderstandings, as just one person in the last session asked the panel speakers to clarify the concept of multiculturalism. I think it's very, very difficult, and it's the same situation with diversity. So if you have a look at diversity, diverse, if you go back to the etymon, so the origin of the word, then what you will find is something completely different from what we typically mean these days. Because this vertere in Latin meant that that is, you turn vertere away from, and not from anything, but you turn away from what is typically held as a norm in the community. So diversity had a negative connotation originally, because it meant that you want to turn away from what is accepted. So it was kind of synonymous with being treacherous, being wretched, or wicked, and even odd. So this kind of disagreeable and unkind characteristic give the ground to hostile meanings that we even have in military English when you think of the term diversion, which is diverting from what the accepted means of gaining your military aims is. So originally, you've got this negative meaning of diversity, which shows a process. The vertere, the turning away, is a process, and it pictures the process that diversity turns away. And then later on, around the 14th century, I mean, in English language, diversity was started to use in a static way, so the focus wasn't on diversion, but on the result, that you had an original accepted common norm, somebody was diverting from it, but then you ended up in a different result. And from that time on, we've got the static meaning of diversity, simply meaning being different. The two things are different. Now then, this is the original notion of diversity. But if you think of diversity, then you might as well have the idea of having many, many, many things commonly held together in one place. And this notion comes from the collocation of biological diversity, where in biological diversity, you've got an ecosystem, and if it's diverse, if it's manifested, then diverse means that you've got a huge variety of genetic resources. Cut it simply, you've got many species living in the diverse area. So diversity has also this natural meaning of positive connotation here, because if a place is diverse, it means that life is rich there. And as we were, the panelists were talking in the first two sessions about multiculturalism and touching upon diversity, you've got a third meaning of diversity, which is basically the idea of promoting diversity at every level, and this is more of a political and moral concept than a neutral one. Okay, so this is kind of the clarification of the concept, and what you see here is it's rather hazy what we mean by it, and this is what I actually found in the documents as well, but let's just move on.
And Natalia, can you tell us, was the diversity always sort of a very central value, a thing that the EU, the European Union, has always pushed? Has it always been there, or is it relatively new?
Right, okay, so the question here is new or old, value or not, actually, because what you find in the documents, if you go back, let's say to the 1970s, then the word diversity hardly came up in the documents. Just to give you a comparison, recently, if you take 1 year, let's say last year, the word diversity appeared nearly 2,000 times in the documents. And in the last 2 decades, each and every year, diversity was talked about at least 1,000 times. Yeah, so that's the recent statistics. But back in the 1970s, you can hardly find any diversity issue. There are years when you've got the word diversity comes up just once. The maximum in the 1970s was coming up 4 times a year. Okay, so there is a huge difference. So you can say that it wasn't pushed, it wasn't topical at that time, I mean, back in the 70s. And the connotation has changed a lot. So in the 1970s, whenever you've got these few examples of diversities mentioned, then it always has a negative connotation, because diversity means that the situation is too complex, the situation is hard to handle, or the situation is not as simple as it should be. So in the EU documents in the 1970s, what you find is diversity should be avoided, because it gives us complication, it gives us a situation which can be abused, and actually there were law cases when the argument went that if there hadn't been diversity, the abuses, the mistreatments hadn't happened. Okay, so back in the 1970s, it was a negative term, and then maybe it's worth to examine how it turned into a positive value, and that happened around the 80s and 90s, because what happened in the 80s is that was a special field where diversity was positively valued. I already mentioned you in the clarification of the concept that we've got this collocation of biological diversity. And back in the 90s is the time when the maintenance of and natural conservation was very much important issue, and the United Nations adopted the Convention on Biological Diversity. And obviously, this is something positive. This is something that we celebrate, and we want to have natural diversity.
Okay, we just hold it there, and we'll come back maybe.
Yeah, okay.
I want to move to Alka. Was multiculturalism always set to fail?
I'd say yes and no. I think it was always set to fail in the, if you like, explicitly stated aims of creating a peaceful and cohesive society for all the reasons that we've discussed earlier. But in a sense, I think it hasn't failed is in it has successfully located political problems into the realm of culture, and in doing so, it's therefore opened up the way for political representatives in the state to shape ever greater swathes of our social and private lives, which is deeply problematic. So I don't think, unfortunately, I wish it had failed in that, but it hasn't failed in that, I don't think. But yes, in terms of the kind of the ideological justification for it, totally, it could never. You know, you cannot create cohesion on the basis of emphasising everybody's difference. You know, you yes belong to us, but belong only if you're so different.
Do you think it's deliberate, not wanting to create a cohesive society, or just mistaken, good faith gone wrong?
No, I think it's probably a combination of lots of things, right? I think. I don't see history as, you know, totally the effects of great powerful individuals, although I think they are very important. I think there are certain moments where different things converge, and if you've got the right individual there at the right time, it can go one way or another way. So I think it's been certainly used strategically. It's been used, in my view, somebody asked earlier from the floor, what are we talking about when we talk about multiculturalism and its latest iteration, more vicious and form of diversity? I think what we're talking about is a rolling back philosophically a rolling back of the Enlightenment value, and the main value is freedom. I think equality and tolerance are ethics, they're not values. And I think politically it's a rolling back of the achievement of the nation state as a unit of political democratic accountability.
Are there necessary preconditions for a multi-ethnic society to flourish and succeed?
yes, that is the cultural confidence. Right, Bill talked about having attempts to technically inculcate cohesion through citizenship tests and linguistic tests. What is the point of coming to a country that forces you to take a language test when every single, well, not every single, the majority of the guardians of our cultural and intellectual institutions cannot say Shakespeare was a wonderful poet. He wrote the best literature in the world. Mm-hmm. You know, you've got people who are embarrassed to say that, from universities to primary schools. You know, so, you know, if you think that loss of confidence is going to be compensated for by a stupid little technical test that you do on a laptop, no, it's not going to work. No.
Yeah. Boris, multiculturalism, what does history tell us? Did multiculturalism exist in the past? How did it exist? What was the end?
Well, of course it did. Thank you for the invitation. I come from Croatia. Actually, in Croatia, we do not have so much multiculturalism, not woke ideology, not political correctness. So you guys from the West, if you ever get into trouble because of what you said today, and you need to find an asylum somewhere, please consider Croatia, okay? Now, why? We've lived in a multicultural state for 72 freaking years. It was called Yugoslavia, and it failed miserably. And we had a war of 5 years to get ourselves rid of that multiculturalism and the greater Serbian aggression. Now, today in Croatia, out of about 150 parliamentarians, 8 belong to minorities, but they feel great in Croatia. We are like 87% Catholics, and the rest, Serbs, Muslims, Czechs, Slovak, Hungarians, but most of them born there and sharing the same culture. So Yugoslavia was a terrible example of multicultural experiment, miserably failing economically, but worst of all, in form of human lives. Only in Croatia, it was 20,000 dead people because of its unwillingness to dissolve peacefully. But what you were probably aiming at when you asked me this question is that I pointed out earlier in our conversation that there is actually a great example in history when the first time in recorded history a persecution of a religious minority started. It started because that little religious minority refused to adapt to multiculturalism. Now, multiculturalism sounds good. You know, if you're young, you are, just about to engage school and your friends, and, you want to be inclusive and tolerant and, whatnot. And of course, the idea itself has been presented as pacifist and as pacifying. But lo and behold, the first empire who tried to impose multiculturalism was the Greek Empire. And they did a great job. They really introduced elements from other nations and created an eclectic new culture, which was to a great benefit and blessing to many people. It was really, in many senses, wonderful. But there was one people who said, good for you, we don't want it. And those were the Jews. Now, the Jews did not try to undermine multiculturalism that the Greeks were offering to the Seleucid and other empires that they created at that time. I'm talking about mid-2nd century BC, okay? The Jews did not try to undermine it. They just said, it's not for us. We want to, we have our way of life, our language, our culture, our God, our temple, so, just go about doing your business and we're happy for you. But what happened instead is that the Greeks turned against the Jews as intolerant because they would not tolerate tolerance. And this story is recorded in the book of Maccabees. And guys, if you did not read it, please do, because it's a great example of what we may fear from these recycled ideologies in near future in Europe.
Thank you, Boris. Boris, if you were to go to sort of the genesis or the heart of what the problem is as you see it today, or the solution, what would that look like?
Well, that's a tough question.
We can go home if you can answer it.
Okay, now the problem. Okay, somebody mentioned the elephant in the room. When it comes to multiculturalism in Europe, I see as main problem jihadi Islamic enterprise of conquering Europe, trying for the third time, actually. You probably know that, Charles Martel repelled it back in 732. Croats and Hungarians repelled it, the Turks in the 16th century. And now they're coming in another way. So jihadi Islam is, in my understanding, the worst thing that is happening. But now let's let me take a step back. Now, as we share common, most of us, Judeo-Christian culture, civilization, and part of it is to be self-critical. Okay, so self-criticism is a good thing. It can go too far, but it's a Jews introduced, they canonized, they're the only people who canonized their critics. If you read the Bible, prophets all speak against Israel, right? Now, let's be self-critical. Young people coming from the most conflicting area in the planet today, which is Middle East and Africa. Okay, young people coming with strong identities, strong religion, strong culture, strong, language, everything is their family, clan. Now they come to Europe, okay, and many of them could be in search for a better life, also spiritually, intellectually, and ideologically. And whom do they meet, at least when they come to the West? Here. They meet people who do not have any special position. They don't have national identity, no religious identity, no ideological identity. They freaking don't know if they are male or female. Now, if I would be a migrant from Syria, I would search for my identity somewhere, and Muslim Brotherhood is right there giving it to them, right? So,
okay.
So this is the problem part. Okay.
Thank you. Alka, I'm not going to ask you for the solution, but what type of ways could we approach multiculturalism without building bigger walls or forced integration? What type of mechanisms could we use to try to address some of the tensions around these issues?
Well, I think I'm a big believer in, I think there's two things you can do, two strategies. I think the one that is used most often in public discourse is the critical one, which is quite right. You have to criticize it for all the reasons that we have been doing. But I think the more difficult one, but equally, if not more necessary, is a constructive one. And that might be, we can't actually do it practically yet, but we have to be able to do it intellectually and imaginatively in thinking of, well, if we were to get rid of all the multicultural lessons, the equality and EDI, conformism in our educational institutions, would that be enough? Mm-hmm. Would we then have the confidence and the identity that could persuade the young Muslims coming here to be part of what we have to offer? I think not, because I think if we'd have had that, we wouldn't be in the position that we're in. I think there was the prior problem of the sapping of what was vital, what was fantastic, what was liberatory, what offered emancipation to everybody. The sapping and the deliberate turning away from that and offering us measly technocratic means and pathetic, intellectual content in education, which is my big thing.
Is it too late then to roll back that tide?
No, I never think it's too late, John. we wouldn't be here if it was too late. Obviously, mm-hmm. It's not too late. We might not win in time. There might be severe losses, more losses to be had, but there's beginning to be, people are beginning to speak out, people mm-hmm. are beginning to push back, so I'm quite optimistic. And
Braverman's comments the other day, mass immigration presents an existential crisis to the Western civilization. Do you go along with that?
Okay, right. Now, this also speaks to what you said and what I think Jose said in response to Bill earlier. Yes, the young Muslim jihadi is like not great for security in Britain, right? It's not great for cohesion. But in Manchester at the Ariana Grande bombing, right, we had this young jihadi with a rucksack. So he was the problem, but he was not the only problem, or even necessarily in that situation the main problem. The main problem was the fact that at least one other security person saw that person, recognized or got suspicious, but felt unable to speak out. And they felt unable to speak out for fear of being labeled Islamophobic. So the problem there, and so what I think we need to be very careful, because it is very easy for our opponents and the majority to label us as xenophobic, far right, blah, 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 blah. So I think and I think it's also just more truthful. I think it's actually a more accurate picture to see the problem. The problem is not just the Muslim jihadis. They are. I'm not suggesting a softy approach or anything, but we need to recognise the problem is also with ourselves, you know, as that case shows, I think.
Natalia, what type of things could we put in action to begin to address some of the challenges that multiculturalism is posing for us?
Well, first of all, I think we need to be clear about the ideas, what we believe in and what we don't believe in. And here, it's important to clarify, for example, when I started talking about biological diversity, then there the connotation, so the feeling of the word was lifted into discourse because everybody is in favor of biological diversity. But actually the meaning of that term was not lifted with the connotation because when you want to maintain an ecological system, then what the experts do is they try to keep out everything which doesn't belong there. And then you will have the diversity of that very ecosystem, right? And then nature as a whole, I mean, the global system is going to be diverse with the particular ecosystems. Now then, what we are facing as a trouble, I think, and here comes our politeness and our sense of being tolerant and that we want to show our goodwill, which is obviously a natural characteristic of ours, is that we don't want to focus on the particular, but we take the global into the particular, which means that, and this is what I found in the EU documents rather problematic, is that there is a shifting of the concept, so that there is a reference to diversity in the sense that something needs to be protected and promoted, but it's not specified what is the thing that the EU wants to protect. If you take, for example, the Welsh language, because diversity typically in the documents is about language diversity, cultural diversity, very few times ethnic diversity. So it's more like the culture and the language which is on the issue. But take, for example, Welsh language. If you want to protect Welsh language, then what you do is you protect Welsh language in Wales, spoken by Welsh people. And it's not the other way around, that you protect every language, and then in Wales you want to have a diversity of all the languages, because then it's not going to give protection to the very language which is a native one there, which is indigenous there. Okay, so what I'm saying is that we need to be very careful when we deal with the connotation and the feeling of the concept, and when we actually have the real meaning, because the two are sometimes not hand in hand.
Mm-hmm. We will come back to our panel, but it's your turn now. I'd like to come out to the audience. I'd like you to put up your hand. Diversity I want to hear about. I want to hear about also if you have any constructive ways that we could address, that people in the room can address some of these issues. Yes, if you can bring a microphone over here.
Thank you. That was a really interesting panel. Natalia, I thought your taking apart of diversity, the origins of the concept itself, has really clarified something for me. And actually, when you look at the question of the session, how did diversity become an EU value? The point of the matter, I think, from what you were saying, was that diversity isn't a value. It's a description. Mm-hmm. But the distinction between that as a description and a project, an ideological project on diversity, is a very different story. Because there, it is an attempt to turn diversity into a value by discrediting everything that existed prior to that, i.e. the nation state, the values that were attached to that, community, the kinds of things that were important. I think this is the point. It's kind of finally the pennies dropped for me from the discussion today. It really goes back to the point that I think Frank made in one of the contributions, that the whole project is very much geared towards discrediting the concept of the nation state. And that's really what's driving this. And when we talk about diversity as a value, that's what we're talking about, as a counterpost to the value of national identity, national consciousness, or whatever. And I think it's really important for us to understand and insist that we are not talking about a value, but a political project.
Thank you. Another hand, please, at the back.
Myself or someone else?
You,
okay,
you can first.
Thanks. Yeah, so I think it was pointed out again and again that to create or achieve something in common, it's best to have something in common. I think that's not very controversial. And diversity by nature seems antithetical to cohesion. Now, I've attended the previous panel and this one, and there's an overwhelming, I think, consensus that diversity undermines a great deal, and I haven't heard a great deal that would suggest that it could either contribute anything to cohesion or that some kind of cohesion could flow from a very high degree of diversity. So, two observations on this. First, do we really have any reason to believe that, do we have any reason to expect any more solidarity, cohesion, common sense of belonging, or sense of togetherness or solidarity from a diverse society than we have to expect it from a joint stock company, a multinational company, in other words, or from a multiracial football club? I don't think we have any such reason.
And the second reason?
Second point, well, it seems to me, based also on the observations I've made in my first question, that multi-diverse, multi-cultural or multi-ethnic societies have a number of competitive disadvantages. So I'm not saying that they are all in the at the bottom, but if they're not, that's because of other strengths and advantages. So, other things being equal, they're less competitive. To stay competitive, they only really have one option, namely to export their ideology of diversity. And that's, in a sense, what the EU is doing.
Thank you. This lady over here in the white shirt, cream shirt.
My name is Anne. I work for an EU agency, but I'm here for personal interest as a social anthropologist. And this is a perspective I wanted to introduce. Going in the same sense as what you said, diversity is destroying nation states. Human mankind, since centuries, identifies itself through family, villages, counties, and nation states. Mm-hmm. So you belong to an ethnic group, so multi-ethnicity has always existed, contrary to multiculturalism, which is a new word in a way. Mm-hmm. So you cohabitate in a country or in a county with other ethnic groups, and you dress the same way, you have the same language, you might get into fights, but you belong to a tribe, to an ethnic group, and this is your identity. And what happens nowadays, this forced introduction of mixture of ethnics, of different countries, languages, religions, in the name of a multiculturalism, which is just a mix that makes the head spin. you lose your identity and you lose your belonging to a nation state. It makes you fragile. I think it is a unnatural process to destructure the society because we have not lived like this. It's a new thing, and I think it won't last. It can't last.
Okay, thank you. At the back. Yeah, I'll be with you in a minute. The back.
Thank you. I just want to have a quick question because I think diversity is much more than a value. It seems to be the tool that's going to solve all our problems. You know, it's going to solve the economy or your business if it fails. It's probably just not diverse enough. Or the university as a business, it's not diverse enough. So how come diversity is now an economic tool? Or you've seen as the great salvation out of our recession. You know, how does this connect to this kind of diversity as a value that we should inherit anyway?
Okay, well, could I hear from someone who hasn't spoken already? Yes, there we are.
Hi, so I'm going to keep this really short. Basically, the panel consensus for the previous two panels has been that we don't have a strong enough cultural identity in Europe or in any Western country to appear attractive to immigrants coming into these countries. So I was wondering, in the same note that multiculturalism and education became very popular, is there any way that education could be used to create a stronger national identity, a stronger sense of patriotism, and what would that look like?
What do you, before you give away the microphone, do you think education could be used in that way?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And this gentleman up here.
Thank you. Multiculturalism, diversity, wokeness, LGBTQ, and every other letter of the alphabet. I have the impression, and I don't know whether it is an invisible hand or just coincidence, but what certain forces in society are doing is to fragmenting our self-esteem, and by doing such, our society in such a way that I don't feel I don't have anything in common anymore with my neighbor. And in such a way, I'm becoming a sitting duck for a certain ideology that forces that diversity upon me. So
what do you think you can do about that?
I have no clue. That's why I'm here.
Okay. Well, let's get some answers. Yes. Yes, there. Sorry.
Yeah, my name is Richard Schenk, and I want to disagree a bit with the gentleman here a bit, because you say that multicultural societies have a structural disadvantage, and I would say it depends on what kind of diversity we are talking about. You mentioned Switzerland. I think Switzerland is a good example for good diversity because you have a certain amount of competition between the different ethnic and language groups. And also, Mr. Boris also mentioned that Croatia could be a good example nowadays. But there is also bad diversity, which is like a politically enforced diversity from above as a tool to destroy something else. And I think we need to introduce some distinction between these two kinds of diversities to propel the discussion a bit further.
Would that suggest that maybe one of the solutions, leave the microphone with him, would that suggest that one of the solutions might be that people stop voting for politicians who are promoting a diversity that they find to be alienating?
Yes, I mean, it will trigger some kind of political backlash if people try to enforce diversity, that's for sure, because it's on the detriment of other diversities that already exist.
Yeah. This gentleman here.
Thank you so much. It's Miksa Maninger, a Hungarian journalist. And since we put in an event the EU and this multicultural problem, I was going to ask a more practical question. For example, if you look at the case of Qatar, there's no terrorism in Qatar. They have lots of money, and I was wondering if we might be overlooking something, that they might be outsourcing a certain problem, that they have these very people who are very strongly religious Muslims, and they can reach out to lots of people, and they might cause internal problems for these countries. So instead, they send these people to Europe, some of them, and they give them lots of funding to build up a network, and then just preach to those who get lost in these Western values, and or the lack of values, in fact. So this we haven't touched so much yet, but are we victims of an outsourcing of a religious leaders program?
Okay, thank you. Would anyone on the panel like to take any of those questions? And Alka, could we definitely address the woman's question there about, could education be a way that we can rebalance things again?
Well, yes, it could be a way if we decide to make education into that kind of a political instrument. But I would strongly argue against that. And the reason I would argue against that is because the value I hold most dearly is that of freedom. And if you make education into a political instrument, you reduce the scope for what is needed to create citizens who can think freely for themselves, make independent judgments. And that's risky, but that's the risk that freedom has, inbuilt into it. Just like tolerance, you can't have tolerance without offence. That's why the diversity agenda goes very strongly hand in hand with protection, and that's why it's you can't have freedom if you're going to be protecting everybody all the time.
I think what the questioner was asking about is, where could that type of conversation happen? Many people feel that it's not happening in the media, for example. Is there other mechanisms, like the media seems to be one vision, one voice these days. So is there other mechanisms by where we can have that national, international conversation?
Well, places like this, maybe. There are campaign groups, the one I'm involved with, beginning to have conversations outside of the traditional conference circuit, for example. And I think it will be a case of personally, I think we'll have to set up more kinds of initiatives and spaces where we can have these discussions, because I don't think the mainstream will allow it. I don't think they're confident enough to allow that yet.
I don't think we should underestimate the importance of what we've just said, that having conversations, people here in this room, going out and talking to other people who maybe you've not spoken to before about these issues, even family and friends. I think that that's an important element of bringing about a conversation that can lead towards some type of change. Boris, any of the issues that were raised in the audience that you'd like to pick up?
Well, there are several, and maybe I would also like to comment a little bit on the issue of education. Now, when we speak about multiculturalism here in the West, basically we speak about two spheres. One is social and one is security. Now, the social part can possibly be solved through, removal of welfare industry for a while. So I won't go there. But when it comes to security and what you've asked about the Qatar, and it's a great question, I think Imam Tawhidi recently greatly answered to that question. You can Google him. Now, what is the West doing wrong in the aspect of education and meeting the security challenge of multiculturalism? And I think you hinted it when you mentioned the terror attack, to which nobody reacted, even though they could have. Namely, look at this. Europe has a great tradition of Oriental studies, which ended somewhere in the first half of the 20th or mid-20th century. Or somebody would say after Edward Said wrote his pamphlet, Orientalism. Now, today in the West, you basically do not have a higher institution of education. I'm talking about academic institution that is teaching Islam from its primary sources. Taking it all, not taking sides, not taking values, evaluations, disagreements. No, I'm talking about methodology. I'm talking about scholarship. Today, in the Western Europe and also America, you will hardly find a study of Orientalist studies in which the theory of jihadism has been studied. What is the theory?
Okay.
Most people take it for granted that it is just a random occurrences, but there is a theory, and that theory is very well framed in primary sources. May I only mention one, Ibn Ishaq, Sirat Rasul Allah. Find it in the Amazon, translated as Life of Muhammad, published by Oxford University back in 1957 when they still could publish whatever they wanted. Read the book, and you will find some interesting topics, and you will ask yourself, why am I not hearing about this at the university? Why am I hearing at the university something that is tickling my ears? Sounds great, lovely. But then security challenges happen as they have been happening in Europe.
Okay. Natalia?
Right, I would like to focus on the issue of values and cohesion. So as you questioned whether diversity is a value or not, now then what I found in the EU document, and this is very interesting, the most typical verb, so action, that goes together with diversity is to promote. Now then, if something is naturally there in the community, if something is an accepted value, if something is a norm, then you don't need to promote it because it's there. Yeah. So this is kind of a telling verb that the promotion kind of sheds light onto the fact that it's not an accepted value, it's a promoted value. And the way the texts kind of sell it as a value is that they put it into a package. In marketing, this is what you call a package. Because diversity typically comes up with such values or such European achievements as freedom and diversity, or democracy and diversity, solidarity and diversity. So once it's connected to something that we celebrate, then you will never question the value, I mean, whether it's a value or not, because the other thing is a value for yourself. So you take it as a package and have the feeling that it is already a value, but it needs promotion, so it's definitely not yet accepted by everyone. And the other one I would like to reflect is the question on cohesion, whether diversity and cohesion can happen at the same time or whether they are contradictory. Now then, if we come back to nature once again and consider biological diversity, in an ecosystem, you've got a great diversity. And the point is that this ecosystem has developed over a long period of time. And there was competition within the ecosystem. And what we see today as a diverse part of nature is actually a long process. Now then, if you have a look at it in kind of human or sociological terms, then you can also say that diversity keeps cohesion as long as it's our common history. Okay, so you can take many different parts of Europe. If you take, for example, Germany with the 16 lands, it's extremely diverse. But it's got a history, it's got a common history of fightings and peaces and everything that they did together. So that long time made the cohesion between the 16 different lands. Mm-hmm. So I think that diversity and cohesion is possible as long as we have a look at what we want to include in the diversity.
Okay. Can we have a microphone over, first of all, to Bill? Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I'm not going to try and challenge Boris's author or book that I can't pronounce as being an influential text for the theory of jihad. But I have to tell you that in the United Kingdom, when a young person walks out of their family home in Bristol or Croydon, they haven't read that book. Yeah, they don't even know much about Islam, because the first thing we know that they buy at the airport on the way out is the book Islam for Dummies. And they listen to the Arctic Monkeys on their iPods, they know who Russell Brand is, But you know, I'm not denying that theory influences people in mysterious ways. But the reality is we need to try and understand what the push factor is from the United Kingdom rather than the pull factor from the other end. And the push factor, I think, and has been touched upon today, it points to a moral failure within the country itself, a moral failure from politicians who don't even know anymore why they say what they say. They know that they believe things as an emotion, but if you ask them to argue for it, they would be incapable of doing so. And that's why they hide behind committees like in Brussels, where they don't have to engage the public or the media in a coherent way. They can avoid those kind of awkward discussions.
Okay.
Yeah, just a very final point on that. And I think that's where education's interesting, but unfortunately education in the contemporary period has all been about respecting other people's voices rather than debating ruthlessly. And that would need to be changed first.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Jacob?
Yeah, a few people have touched on the fact that, and Bill just did it in a way, that kind of underlying lots of these concerns and difficulties with the politics of multiculturalism is a kind of a crisis of the nation state itself in Western European countries. What do we stand for? Who are we? Difficult questions to answer. But as a kind of a contribution to that, I want to ask the panel whether they think is that a general crisis or is it a crisis of the elite? Like ordinary people, if you work especially in lower paid jobs, they have no trouble mucking about and getting on with people from all kinds of backgrounds and can make friends in kitchens or in serving at Pret or wherever, right? That they have no trouble there. It's not ordinary people who redrew education policies to emphasize differences. It's not ordinary people who created housing policies that promote ghettoization. It's not ordinary peoples who gamed the court system so that people can come to places where maybe they shouldn't be. It's not ordinary people who instituted visa policies that are really easy to game. It's not ordinary people who did those things, right? So the institutions are detached from ordinary people, and there's a general question we should face about how do we reclaim the institutions that supposedly kind of represent people but don't. How do we do that? I don't think it's an elite crisis. Sorry, I don't think it's a general crisis. I think it's an elite crisis.
Okay, thank you. The gentleman at the back.
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry to take the word again, but I'm a little bit alarmed by what Mr. Havel is implying. I think it's Mr. Havel, yes.
Yes, it is.
So you seem to be implying that the threat that we face is Islam, right? That's what I...
Jihadism.
Jihadism.
Not Islam. We have...
All right.
Majority of Muslims are peaceful citizens we love living and working with.
Okay. Yeah, but first of all, people who like nation states forget that nation states don't exist for even 200 years. Before, people lived in the kind of European Christian culture which was dominated by Latin and so on. So the nation state is very young. So saying that this is now our anchor is to me a little bit strange, to be honest. And then I'm also wondering if the real threat, and this is what someone else implied, this is also what the lady implied, what the lady in the middle implied, what I'm noticing in my life is a lack of humanities, you know? Mm-hmm. So people are looking on the smartphone and they're swiping around, and I don't have a problem with it. But what educates people into intelligent beings would seem to be reading books, mm-hmm. Humanities, right? This is what cultures you, what arms you, what gives you cohesion, which is what happened in Middle-Age Europe, right? Everybody read Dante and Thomas à Kempis and all these people. And so I'm wondering, basically, if the problem that we're facing, which we are calling multiculturalism, what is the cause of it? Is it an outside cause, like jihadism? Is it something within our history, within our own culture? Okay. What is it?
What is it?
Know?
Thank you.
It's not so clear.
Can you give the microphone to the woman in black there?
Hi. About 3 years ago, there was an interesting study that I read. Whole Foods is a shop that is sponsored by Amazon. And they did a test where they ran a heat map about which stores are doing better than others, and it came down to a number of factors. One of them was diversity. And what they found was the shops that did very well had a coherent group of people, and the ones that hired more diverse populations had higher profits. And they used that knowledge to then implement it throughout Whole Foods. So I guess what we see by that concrete example that doesn't have much to do with education or other things that we've been discussing on a kind of more abstract plane is that this information is out there and it is being used to atomize social units, and it's forming a different kind of cohesion, a kind that's based on mistrust, because you have no way of kind of collectively unionizing to advocate for your own interests or that of your cultures.
Thank you. You're next. You're next.
It doesn't work. I've been part of several Erasmus programs, and the question that I wanted to propose to you is more of an advice seeking, because I'm 24 and diversity has been an environment which surrounded me for almost 4 or 5 years in university level. Diversity of student groups, student initiatives, people from all countries gathering together. And the question that I would have is, why is our culture worth preserving in an age where being exposed to new principles, new ideologies is an exciting thing? Of course, it can have its changes, but why is it worth preserving our cultures? Okay. I'm not saying that I have a clear idea on this. I think I do, but I just want to get something tangible from you.
Okay. Over here, the microphone. Raise your hand. Yeah.
Just wondering what the panel think about why it is that when we think about diversity, either as a value or a description, it's become so concentrated on the ethnicity, race, or skin color, rather than a whole range of other things that could be diverse. So we have lots of discussion about getting workplaces to be more diverse in terms of ethnic backgrounds, but much less about getting them to be diverse in terms of age, or in terms of educational qualification, or in terms of social background, or any of the other things that you could say contribute to diversity. So it seems to me it's a very specific form of diversity rather than a broader one.
Okay, I'm going to come back to the panel, and I'd like to start off with you, Alka.
Okay. Okay, let me just, there's really interesting questions here. Elite crisis or general crisis? Yes, it's an elite, but it soon will become a very general one. But that for the reason is that I think there's something really fundamental going on here, and it touches on what Anne's question is: why ethnicity or skin color, even more more degradedly? And that's because that's not just the least interesting aspect; it's the thing we have no control over. Right? Everything else we have control over, and I think what is happening. Goran asked earlier, what if we don't have anything in common? We look at the panoply of humanity, so different. We eat differently, we have families, different families, etc., etc. But that's looking at the wrong thing, right? That's looking for something empirically that unites us. Ontologically, at a different level, we are all human, and that commonness is in our plurality. It's not a kind of consequentialist thing. It just is. We are human. We are different. It's it's like there's a great philosopher. He said it's not. You don't think of the Descartesian formulation. I think, therefore I am. When you say I am, you are already thinking. Right? To just say that implies a human consciousness, and I think that's really being lost. And that's the basis of our freedom. And what we're seeing is that we are being human subject through this diversity agenda on every level, philosophical, intellectual, political, is redefining the human subject from someone who is thinking and able to ask questions so that we don't just accept any education, patriotic, multicultural, or whatever form, just because somebody says so. We think and accept it on our own volition. That is being redefined, and instead we're being encouraged, schools are doing it, universities are doing it, to become individuals who are less able, because we don't know our own history, we don't know philosophy or art or anything like that, and we're less willing, morally less willing to do that. But what we are becoming is more compliant. And that's the real danger, I think, of this.
So one of the solutions would be for us not to be as compliant.
Absolutely.
Okay. Boris, the point that was made that ordinary people don't have this crisis a lot of the time, that it is something that institutions seem to be having, and how can we take back those institutions and make those institutions accountable in a way that would help in the crisis we face?
That's not the question I hoped you will ask me, but okay, I'll proceed with that one. The institutions have been fooling us long enough, greatly and creatively, very much. And at some point, you need media, you need schools, you need intellectuals who are going to address a whole lot more people than the small groups as we are now. But how are the elites creative? As we were talking today, a picture came to my mind. Imagine multiculturalism is endangering West Europe, primarily Western Europe now, and imagine it as a bridge, between two hills, and there is a abyss down there. So people walk on that bridge of multiculturalism, and every once in a while, people fall down, some get killed, some get hurt badly. Now the politicians come and say, we will solve the problem. And everybody says, well, what are you going to do? And they said, we are going to build a hospital down there. So as soon as somebody falls down, we're going to take care of you. And everybody goes, wow, what a great idea. Let's go for it. We vote. And that's exactly what's happening. The core issue, fixing the freaking bridge, is not really as addressed at all. But how do we cope with all the fallen? We do that pretty effectively.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Let's change that.
Thank you. Natalia.
Right, I would like to get back to the education question and education issue, whether education could help develop or strengthen national identity. And I think education in the Western world typically, or in the Western part of Europe, is focusing more on skills these days than on building up a knowledge or passing on knowledge of the previous generations. And I think that two different types of views on education result in two types of strength of national identity. Because if the next generation learns the skills only, then they will not have the sense of belonging, because they were not provided enough information about their past. They don't know about their own history, because what they are provided with is a bit of history from here, a bit of history from there, and concepts are explained through various examples, but not their own history. So what I think is important here with building national identity is focusing on what is our own tradition, what is our own knowledge, and passing it on to the next generation.
Does that seem bad to you, Alka? Is that not something that would be possible in schools?
Yes, it will. Of course it would. And the skills agenda is just part of the de-intellectualization of education. But this is what I would say. When you say, so for example, and this is happening in Britain, there's a very contested area, the history curriculum in particular, is that when you say you're going to teach British, if you say, for example, right, enough of this multicultural rubbish. Let's have proper British history, right? Now, that's fine as far as it goes, and there have been many on the conservative right who would support that and would like that. But you see, that's already been done and tried, right? And it doesn't speak to what we have today. So what I would suggest is you have a British history, but it has to be really rethought, taking account of scholarship that's happened in the modern era, because there is good scholarship that's happened in the modern era across all, not just in the West either, as it happens. So you look at, for example, something like the eradication of sati in India, and it's not presented as a great gift of the British Empire, because that would be partially true, but not very true. And you don't present it as, a kind of something just that happened within India, because that would also be very partial. If you look at just take that example, a much fuller historical account would be one that traces the interconnections, the inspiration that someone like Manhajan Roy got from his interaction with the British in India and came to Britain to agitate for political support to destroy that practice in India, which was a progressive thing. So that's what I mean about improving it.
You're not against the idea of using education in order to inculcate information within the population?
It's knowledge, that's thinking, it's engaging.
But you don't want it to be politicized?
No, I mean, we're arguing that we don't want the multiculturalists to politicize education. We have to be examples of what we preach, I think, here. I don't think we can use the same methods.
Yeah. Okay. Here, microphone here.
Thanks very much. Listening to Alka, I'm wondering whether it's too late. Because I think back to my parents and myself growing up in the 70s and the 80s, and they had an idea of what it meant to be British. And there were certain traditions and family things that we did, annual visits to the military tattoo, standing up and singing the national anthem, being proud of all these sorts of things. By the time I was 18, I was a bit embarrassed by that. And that all seemed rather, outdated. And in fact, my parents' attitudes to people moving into the area of a different culture, I found quite backward and racist. Today, they would just about remember what it meant to be British then. They wouldn't have an idea of what it means to be British now.
Okay.
And so my point is, and my question is, and if you take London as a prime example, it's actually really not part of the UK anymore.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah? It's an independent city-state. So when things have gone so far, how do you have a sense of what it means to be British?
Got the question. So, this lady here first. Very briefly, okay?
I'll be very brief, yeah.
Good.
So I really appreciate Natalia kind of clarifying what my point was, which was a bit naive of me to assume that national identity could be separated from politics, because I was going about it from the perspective of properly teaching and approaching history with honesty from both sides, looking at the good and the bad that our own national history has done, whether that be the UK or the US. And I just wanted to clarify that what do you do about the fear in the classroom? What do you do about the fear to criticize things? Because there was that story earlier, someone said that someone saw suspicious behavior, but they couldn't do anything about it because they were scared of being labeled. And you see a lot of students struggling with that. I mean, if a police officer could struggle with it, students will as well, especially if there's a sense of you can't question the narrative, you can't question the history. So I think that sums up my question.
Yeah, that's great. And here.
Thank you, Ben Sagat from MCC. I would like to introduce a bit of Hungarian perspective in this question, because I learned a lot from this discussion. In Hungary, we do not have these problems of multiculturalism, but we see that there is this saying in the European Union and in the European Treaty that united in diversity. And my question is, in this case, in the case of Hungary, for example, when Hungary is claiming to be specific, different from other member states, choosing a different path in value questions or social questions, why this kind of diversity is not respected and is, you know, like treated as a...
It's a wrong type of diversity.
Yeah, so there is a wrong diversity, and
okay.
so which is the good diversity?
Thank you. I'm going to come to the panel in a minute with, you can address any of the points that were raised in the audience in your final comments and remarks. Beforehand, I'll just come to this gentleman here. Yeah, wait in the microphone. Okay.
I think that the lady over there made such a good point that we seem to be focusing on racial, ethnic, and religious diversity when there's other types of diversity which are there for us to potentially, you know, really take advantage of and make use of. We talked earlier about all the ethnic minority politicians which have made it high up in Britain. And another key common denominator between all of them is that many of them are privately educated, for example. So you can see that, in a sense, it's actually quite homogenous in a way in terms of social class. So I think that it's not so much do we get rid of diversity as a principle, perhaps the conversation should be how should diversity be repackaged? Because when it comes to maybe a diversity of skills, expertise, specialisms, those are the kind of things that would help us have a more productive future. So it's not so much getting rid of diversity, but rather restoring it and focusing on the things which, in their diversity, could actually help us move forwards to a brighter future.
Natalia.
Right. I'd like to get back to education and history and the issue of whether it's politicized or not. I think the first thing is that history should be taught. Our own history should be passed on to the next generation. And then the second question is whether it's politicized or not. In Hungarian history, during the years of communism, we were not allowed to talk about many parts of our history in a manner that we are free to talk about these days. And still, we've got my generation and the older generation who lived during communism, still we have a sense of continuity of the Hungarian history because we talked about it. Okay, not in the manner that we accepted it these days. Several periods were especially problematic. But at least we still have the sense of continuity, so it was never broken. But once history is not taught because there is a fear of being politicized, then the next generation will not get this sense of continuity. And once it's lost, I'm not sure if it will be ever be able to pick up, because it's something that needs to be passed on from the living generation to the next generation.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to go back on what I am all for education and the importance of it. I think you're right, it isn't taught. In Britain, it's not even a compulsory subject, and when it is taught, it's modularized and it is utterly incoherent. I think that should be changed. The government's had a commission that's been sitting on its backside for about 2 years trying to come up with something, and it hasn't done. And that's because they're just too scared to make a judgment on it. But I do think you can overstate the case, because I don't think you get the sense of Britishness, or that somebody was talking about. Education is hugely important, but it's not the only thing, right? It's when you go outside, it's the things that are celebrated in the popular culture. It's the way your political class addresses its people. If the political class addresses you as if you are, continually addresses you, I'm not just saying be nice to me, but continually addresses you as if you're something to be managed, to fit a preconceived conclusion that they have decided, some outcome, then it kind of saps your will, right? Is it too late? I don't know. I really don't know. I don't know. But I have hope, because when I talk to sort of, for example, mixed race young people, not even just necessarily mixed race, but I happen to have spoken to quite a few mixed race people, they're actually really pro-British, right? They actually, you know, they've kind of gone back. They're quite au fait, quite uncomfortable with like going back to one place that they come from, appreciating and not appreciating aspects of that. Okay. But they're bloody glad. Sorry, they're very glad to come home to Britain. So there's something still there.
And Boris, briefly, finally.
Well, the many issues we tackled today. I'm a firm believer in nation state as a most natural framework for anybody's, fulfillment. In that nation state in Europe, we should pass on our values, Judeo-Christian values, but the main thing in those values is human life. And that is something very precious we should pass on. I think we're so far very cautious with it, this very, like walking on eggs, not to hurt anybody. On the other side, the other side is rapidly changing this society to the worse. There are 3 fields in which you change society in the next generation or 2. That's education, media, and law. In those 3, a multiculturalist elite is definitely far ahead to what any alternative is, and that needs to change: education, media, and law.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for a very stimulating discussion. Thank you for your participation. We're going to have a coffee break now for 30 minutes. But beforehand, I would like you to give a round of applause and thank our great panelists.